Hi, RPSE 465. In this final part of the recording for week 1, I'm going to address language development in children from birth through preschool. One important disclaimer here is that there's wide variation in quote-unquote typical language development. Young children develop at different speeds and in different ways. And when we refer to ages in this presentation, I really mean the average age at which a structure or function develops. It's important to understand that there is a wide range of typical development around this average, and that children will sometimes follow individual patterns of development. When a child deviates significantly from the so-called typical developmental sequence, it's important to intervene as early as possible. Therefore, a knowledge of language development is essential for understanding so-called typical development and for recognizing deviations from the so-called norm. So a traditional view of infant development is that babies come into the world as a blank slate, ready to be filled with experiences that will guide their development through childhood to become fully functioning adults. However, research conducted during the past several decades has seriously challenged that traditional view of early childhood, and we now understand that infants are born ready to learn in many ways. They are not merely passive recipients of information from their environment, they're active learners who influence and even shape their environment. Even during the pre-linguistic stage, when babies do not exhibit what we call language, they're developing the necessary prerequisites to the emergence of language. Newborns have been found to have some surprising language comprehension abilities. For example, it appears that they can discriminate between languages. In one study, for example, French babies who were played samples of French and Japanese sounds listened more attentively to the French, indicating that they recognized the language they were hearing in their environment. Of course, if these babies had been exposed to Japanese, they would have showed a preference for that language. Using a technique called high amplitude sucking, in which the frequency of sucking to stimuli is measured, researchers have found that infants as young as 1 month can discriminate speech sound differences, such as pa and ha. Using cerebral blood flow as a measure, Sanito and colleagues found in 2007 that neonates attended more to child-directed speech from their mothers than when their mother spoke to another adult. Other research has found that babies as young as 7 months old can discriminate between familiar and unfamiliar words, although younger babies appear unable to do this. From the moment of birth or even before, infants move their head in response to the human voice. Their eyes widen and body tension increases in anticipation of intention from their caregiver. Their wakefulness, fuzziness, or other signs let caregivers know when they're tired or when they're ready for interaction. After a few weeks, interactional sequences begin to develop. The infant gazes at their caregiver's face. The caregiver responds with a smile or some comforting words. Feeding can be a wonderful interactional opportunity. The baby sucks and pauses and then gazes at the caregiver, who responds with a smile or touch. The infant responds by resuming sucking. These interactions evolve into a give and take that begins to resemble conversational turn-taking with initiation and response. Vocalization is also part of the early communicative interaction. At first, most infants' sound productions are reflexive in nature, like burps, gurgles, or other sounds that are responses to physical states. But caregivers respond to these vocal productions as if they're meaningful communication. Parents typically claim that they can identify the meaning of their child's crying. Caregivers will say that their child's hungry and wants to be fed based on the way the child is crying. Parents may or may not be accurate in identifying the meaning of the child's crying. This seems to be less important than the fact that their child's vocalizations initiate a response. In their intensive study of language development, Hart and Risley reported that long before children begin saying words, they had learned essential skills of interaction, such as getting and holding their caregiver's attention, taking turns, and maintaining interaction. As infants move through the first 6 months of life, their vocal repertoire increases from reflexive sounds to cooing and babbling. At first, these are mostly vowel-like sounds. The sound that's produced is similar to what infants in the 2 to 4 month age range produce, this kind of vowel-like ka sound. Although this may not seem like a particularly significant event, it is important because the baby's gaining control over sound production apparatus. These early sounds are the result of control of the flow of air. In addition, as the baby progresses through this stage, the sounds are increasingly produced in response to the caregiver. This is the very beginning of vocal interaction. Somewhere between 3 and 6 months of age, babies begin to babble. Consonant sounds begin to enter the baby's vocalizations. It's as if the baby's playing with sound. There's a common belief that all babies babble all of the sounds of every language, gradually filtering out those sounds that are not actually heard in the language. However, Menn and Stolgarman in 2009 pointed out that research has found that rather than producing every sound, babies babble a limited set of sounds, especially sounds that appear earlier in speech development. A pre-verbal child is a social being. During the period of 6 to 12 months, there's a major change in the way that young children communicate. Initially, babies are dependent on their caregivers and ascribe meaning to their behavior. That is, caregivers act as if their child's communicating, interpreting burps and giggles as attempts to interact in this early stage of communication has been called the pre-locutionary stage. By age 7 months or so, there's a significant but subtle change in the infant's behavior. The baby follows the parent's movements with her eyes and head and becomes distressed if the parent leaves the room. Children of this age have been found to show interest in toys when there are caregivers present, but stop playing when the caregiver leaves. By 8 to 10 months of age, the infant begins to respond to social gestures such as hand waving to signal bye-bye. The young child is beginning to enter what some linguists call the elocutionary stage of communication. At this stage, children begin to use intentional communication. A significant development in this period is joint attention. During this period, the young child shows increasing interest in objects, such as maybe a favorite cup or toy or set of play items like keys. Babies begin to reach for these preferred objects and play with them. They're beginning to show intentionality in their play and making more than random movements, accidentally touching an object. Rather, they're intentionally reaching for and manipulating objects. When caregivers respond, joint attention takes place. Caregivers may join in the play, shaking the child's toy or keys to get the child's attention. They may label the item, saying things like, "See the keys? See the cup? Do you want the cup?" Researchers have found that when mothers engage in joint attention and label the objects, their babies increase their vocabulary faster. In addition, children whose parents or caregivers respond to their child's initiation of interaction have been found to have greater language development later in life. There are two types of communication that we see in a pre-verbal child. Throughout that elocutionary stage, young children are learning to use gestures to get what they want. Bates in 1979 identified two predominant types of communication functions expressed by these early gestures. One is proto-declarative and the other is proto-imperative. When the child uses gestures such as pointing at an object, not to request the object, but to participate in conversation, kind of commenting like, "Hey, look at that." This is proto-declarative, more of a commenting. communication function. On the other hand, when the child gestures in an attempt to control or manipulate others, such as pointing to the object and vocalizing in order to get the adult to get the object for the child, this is proto-imperative. Somewhere between 10 and 15 months, remember there's this broad, wide range of typical development, children begin to make the transition to the locutionary stage of communicative development. Now, the developing child is beginning to combine vocalizations with gesture, to request, demand, comment. At first, these vocalizations might sound just like sounds, but gradually they begin to take on the characteristics of adult speech. So there's this interaction between caregiver and infant. It seems that children and adults are engaged in communicative interaction right from the beginning. Babies are active participants in communication, performing in ways that get an adult's attention and prompt a response. Adults are engaging their children in communication by altering their own language to fit the linguistic and cognitive abilities of their child. But by the time babies are 9 months old, prior to the emergence of spoken language, they can express a wide range of communicative intentions, including request, demand, rejection. At the same time, the young child's developing a greater repertoire of communicative functions. Her vocalizations are becoming increasingly sophisticated, although she cannot yet produce adult-like language. Babbling gradually takes on many of the characteristics of adult language. At this stage, babbling is characterized by consonant and vowel clusters like ba, ba, and sequences that are similar in length as adult speech. At times, this reduplicated babble even sounds like an adult sentence, with the intonational contours that sound like questioning or demanding. Remember, too, that babies are not just developing expressive language. At this stage, their receptive language is far ahead of their ability to express themselves. They are able to understand more words and respond to questions and commands. Parents often express amazement about the amount their child can understand. And research has confirmed that caregivers have observed this and that it matches evidence that they found in studies. There's a technique that was tested called preferential looking paradigm that found children can understand a variety of language structures before they can use them. By about 12 months of age, most children are on the verge of producing their first real word, but they've already learned a lot about language. They can understand much more than they can produce. They have learned to express a variety of intentional communicative functions and have learned how to participate in conversation. So our takeaway here is receptive language develops before expressive language. We'll have this idea come up again, especially when we talk about vocabulary development in this course. To summarize language development in the first 12 months, we have to recognize the relationship between language and communication. There is communicative intent behind the interactions between the infant and caregiver. For example, adults know the child does not understand, but act as though the infant does understand. This infant's reactions influence how the adult responds. Markers of this communication are visible through gestures, pointing, eye gaze, vocalization, and persistent attempts to communicate. Most parents remember the excitement of hearing their baby's first words. This remarkable achievement does not happen overnight. However, indeed, many babies, they don't wake up one morning just speaking in full sentences. In fact, this progression from shrieking, first heard in the hospital, to the controlled utterance of dada or mama is slow, systematic, and predictable for most children. We saw the inspiring and massive collection of data by Deb Roy's team in the Birth of a Word TED Talk. On a much smaller and non-funded scale, I recorded my daughter's expressive language development through her first 2 years. On the slide now are words that she consistently used with communicative intent at 19 months of age. I'm going to play a video of what some of her early language and literacy looked like, sounded like at this stage.
I don't know how many shoes, lots of shoes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 shoes. Yay! Yay! Do you see a chicken? you have a
She's
specific
tapping the
what does it
book,
say?
saying yay in
Go,
response
look.
to what's
Where's the
happening in the
doggy?
book. Seeing me handle the book,
Where's the doggy?
turning the page,
See on that page? I see a bear.
looking at pictures. We've got joint attention.
Hit. Hit.
Some observations and takeaways here are the use of these two-word utterances. This is also referred to as telegraphic speech. Kind of sounds like a maybe text message or back in the day a telegraph. Like shoes off, hi dad, doggy woof. Sometimes she would say mama when greeting dad, and sometimes she would say hi dad when greeting me. In the second year of life, language learning goes so quickly. Research shows us that this occurs at like the rate of one word per week at the beginning of year two, and then one word per day at the end of the second year of life. For the first 5 years of life, children are learning essentially one new word for every 2 waking hours. It's so exciting to think about the amount of language that children are learning in this early preschool period of development. Usually, children use two-word utterances first. These are predominantly made up of content words, mostly nouns, and not function words. This idea of telegraphic speech are these two-word utterances. They do kind of resemble maybe instant messaging, text messaging. They're primarily nouns and sound a little bit like how you might imagine learning English as a foreign language. They're focused on content, not so much the verb endings or use of articles, things like alley go, me outside, baby cry. Typically after this 12-month to 26-month period, the emergence of speech follows a predictable pattern. For example, like 65% of the lexicon of children in this first year of life through their second year is made up of what we call mid-level nouns. Dog is an example of a mid-level noun. It's not so specific that it names a particular breed like collie or dachshund, but it's also not too general to refer to a broader category like animal. The next most frequent words are action words like sit, eat, go, followed by modifiers like hot and cold. Between 27 months and 30 months, these utterances become longer and more complex. One of the major developments in the emergence of grammatical morphemes are prefixes, suffixes, prepositions. These morphemes are of the type that add meaning only when attached to a root word. Roger Brown's work shows that there's a highly predictable sequence of acquisition to these grammatical morphemes. Prepositions, such as in and on, and the present progressive ing are usually the first acquired. Then comes the use of the plural s marker and so on. Of course, these constructions do not emerge fully formed or in the exact order that Brown and his colleagues claimed. As children learn to use these morphemes, they make a number of errors, so-called errors in usage, using the endings incorrectly, maybe saying something like deerses instead of deer and watch for the deer, or failing to use them at times. As children continue to develop, however, they learn and use grammatical morphemes more consistently and accurately. Pronouns also begin in this early phase, with I, my, me occurring most frequently. So Brown's categories of morphemes are represented in his pioneering book on language development. Roger Brown described this longitudinal study of language development of 3 children, Adam, Eve, and Sarah. Working with this group of remarkably talented assistants, Brown and his colleagues observed, recorded, and analyzed each step of language growth through these children. Their observations were reported in the book that's called A First Language, The Early Stages. This is still the most comprehensive description of language development available. One of Brown's key observations is the child's utterances are an indicator of language development. So we have this formula for calculating what we call mean length of utterance, or MLU. It's relatively simple to calculate MLU, mean length of utterance, and this has become a widely used measure of language development. Even though it's only a rough measure of language complexity, it's calculated by counting the total number of morphemes in a language sample. This is usually an oral language sample, and you would be calculating this from a transcript, where you divide by the number of utterances in the sample. For example, if there were 100 morphemes in a sample of 50 sentences, the MLU would be 2.0, which roughly equates to a 2-year-old aged child's language sample. So on this slide now are sentences that are featured in the video that's also linked on Canvas. In the video, my colleague Jen Freeberg is reading through sentences like "the boy's sock was white" and kind of models how to count. If we imagined that all of these 10 sentences that are on the slide came from one child in one language sample transcript, we'd have 10 utterances, 10 sentences. We'd count the number of morphemes in each utterance. Our total number of morphemes divided by 10 utterances would give us the MLU for this child. Again, it's meant to be approximation as a measure of language development that corresponds with age. So an MLU of 5.5 roughly correlates with a 5.5-year-old child.